Big Shaq was minding his own business at a grocery store when the doors slammed open. A cop stormed in, cutting the line like he owned the place. "Ring me up. Now." The young cashier, Jamal, stayed polite. "Sir, I just have a few customers ahead of you." The cop's face twisted with anger. 1 second, Jamal was standing. The next, boom! He was on the floor, clutching his face. The store went dead silent. Customers froze. Cameras were already rolling. But before the cop could gloat, a massive shadow fell over him. Shaq had seen enough. What happened next shook the entire city, exposed a corrupt system, and left the officer begging for mercy. Stay till the end, because this story takes a turn no one saw coming. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The grocery store was alive with movement, shopping carts squeaking, cash registers ringing, the steady hum of conversation filling the air. Aisles were packed with customers grabbing last-minute groceries, kids tugging at their parents' hands, and employees moving swiftly to keep up. At the front of the store, Jamal, a 19-year-old grocery clerk, stood at his usual spot behind the checkout counter, carefully bagging a customer's items. Despite the long shift, he wore a smile, his easygoing nature making the line move smoothly. Not far away, Shaq stood in the snack aisle, casually browsing, his massive frame making the shelves around him look almost small. He was in town for an event and had stopped in for a quick snack, blending into the background as much as a 7 feet 1 inch basketball legend possibly could. Then boom! The doors slammed open, hitting the wall with a force that made heads turn. Sergeant Carter stormed in. Dressed in his police uniform, the bulky middle-aged cop walked with the arrogance of a man who thought the world owed him something. His boots stomped loudly against the tile floor as he made a direct line for the registers. He didn't glance at the people waiting, didn't acknowledge the line. He just cut straight to the front. "Ring me up." Now Jamal looked up, momentarily startled by the intrusion, but still maintaining his professional demeanor. "Sir, I just have a few customers ahead of you," he said politely, nodding toward the people already waiting in line. That should have been the end of it. Any normal person would have either waited or left, but Carter wasn't a normal person. His face twisted with rage, his fists clenching at his sides. "Disrespectful little..." Then it happened. Boom! Before anyone could react, Carter swung a fist straight into Jamal's face. The impact was brutal. Jamal stumbled backward, knocking over the bagging station, his body hitting the ground with a painful thud. Customers gasped in horror as the young clerk clutched his jaw, eyes wide with shock. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a shadow fell over Carter. The cop barely had time to react before a giant hand clamped down on his shoulder, gripping with enough force to make him flinch. The store's fluorescent lights seemed dim compared to the towering figure standing behind him. A deep, rumbling voice growled, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Carter felt the pressure first. A grip like a vice clamping down on his shoulder with unmistakable strength. It wasn't just a touch. It was a warning. A presence loomed behind him, casting a massive shadow over the store's bright lights. The moment he turned, his stomach dropped. Standing before him was Shaquille O'Neal. Carter's arrogance cracked for the briefest second. His eyes flickered upward, taking in the sheer size of the man towering over him. Shaq's frame dwarfed him completely, his broad shoulders blocking out everything behind him. His face was calm, but his eyes, cold, unforgiving. The store had fallen into complete silence, every customer frozen in place, watching. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerators in the background. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his voice low and dangerous. "You hit a kid. Over a checkout line?" Carter's jaw tightened. His pulse was hammering in his ears, but he wasn't about to back down. Not in front of all these people. His grip on his belt stiffened as he squared his shoulders, trying to regain control of the situation. He scoffed. "I'm an officer of the law," he said, his voice dripping with forced authority. "You think you can just put your hands on me?" Shaq's eyes narrowed. In a flash, he reached down and snatched the badge right off Carter's chest. The metal piece ripped from the uniform with a sharp snap, leaving the cop standing there stunned. Shaq turned the badge over in his massive palm, inspecting it like it meant nothing. Then, with a small smirk, he flicked it onto the counter. "Not today, you ain't." Carter's face turned red. His mouth opened, then closed. He could feel the stares boring into him, the cameras recording, the whispers growing louder. Shaq had flipped the power dynamic in an instant. His fingers twitched toward his radio. He didn't care how big Shaq was. He wasn't about to be humiliated like this. Carter ripped the radio from his belt, bringing it up to his mouth with shaky fingers. "Back up, now!" The tension in the store exploded. Would the arriving officers back Carter up, or would things take an even wilder turn? The tension in the store was thick enough to choke on. Every customer stood frozen, their eyes darting between Shaq and Sergeant Carter, waiting to see what would happen next. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, but the only real sound was the crackling of Carter's radio as his desperate call for backup went through. Shaq didn't flinch. His massive frame remained steady, his eyes locked onto Carter, who was now gripping his belt as if it were a lifeline. The power dynamic had shifted, and Carter knew it. Within minutes, the automatic doors burst open again. Two uniformed officers stormed inside, hands hovering near their holsters. They had heard the urgency in Carter's voice, had assumed they were walking into a dangerous situation, but as soon as they laid eyes on what was actually happening, both men hesitated. Carter, still red-faced and furious, immediately pointed at Shaq. "Arrest him! He threatened an officer!" One of the officers, a younger cop with short-cropped hair, glanced at Shaq. His face instantly paled. His partner, an older officer, took one look at the towering figure standing across from Carter and swallowed hard. The younger cop muttered under his breath, "Bro, that's Shaquille O'Neal." Carter's confidence wavered. "I don't care who he is. He assaulted me." Shaq let out a slow, deliberate breath. Then a grin spread across his face. Not an amused grin, a dangerous one. "Y'all still want to do this?" Silence. The two responding officers exchanged a look. There were cameras everywhere. Customers had their phones raised, recording every second of this disaster. And now they were expected to arrest Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most famous men in the world, over a checkout line dispute. This was a career-ending mistake waiting to happen. The older cop cleared his throat. His voice was careful, deliberate. "Sergeant Carter, maybe we should, take a step back." And Carter whirled around, eyes bulging. "Step back? Are you kidding me? He put his hands on me. You saw him take my badge. That's assault." The younger cop hesitated. He looked at Carter, then at Shaq, then back at Carter. Shaq watched it all unfold, arms crossed, completely at ease. The younger officer exhaled slowly, then muttered something Carter wasn't expecting. "Maybe we should hear Shaq's side." Carter's face twisted in shock. His own men weren't backing him up, and now the entire store was watching his authority crumble. The moment Sergeant Carter's fist collided with Jamal's face, the entire grocery store changed. At first, there had been nothing but a collective gasp. A moment of stunned silence where no one could quite believe what they had just witnessed. Then, like a chain reaction, phones were pulled out, cameras were aimed, and record buttons were pressed. It started with one person, then another, and soon almost every bystander in the store was capturing the moment from different angles. The heavy air was filled with quiet murmurs, sharp whispers of disbelief. Some people shook their heads in shock, others stood frozen in place, processing what had just happened. But the camera lenses did not blink. They recorded every second, ensuring that what had just taken place could never be denied. Jamal, the teenage grocery clerk, was still on the ground, his hand pressed against the side of his face where Carter had struck him. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as he tried to comprehend why he had just been hit, for doing nothing but his job. Shaq, towering over Carter, had yet to move. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone made the disgraced cop shrink. From the other side of the checkout area, a woman holding her phone shook her head and muttered under her breath, "This cop just assaulted a teenager for no reason." Carter's entire body stiffened. His head jerked toward her, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to argue. But then he saw the camera still recording, the screen reflecting his own furious expression back at him. Shaq took a step closer, the ground seeming to shake beneath his weight. His deep voice was calm, but each word carried an undeniable weight. "Go ahead," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Explain yourself." Carter swallowed hard. His mind raced, searching for an excuse, a justification, anything that could shift the blame away from himself. His lips parted, but no words came. His throat tightened as he tried to force something out. His heart pounded against his rib cage, each second that passed making the pressure in his chest grow heavier. He could feel the cameras on him, the eyes, the judgment. Finally, his voice cracked as he stammered, This is being taken out of context." A few people in the crowd scoffed. Someone laughed under their breath. Near the self-checkout, a teenager holding her phone smirked. "Bro, we got like 10 angles. Ain't no context saving you." Carter's face turned an alarming shade of red. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breath quickening. The authority he once carried so effortlessly was slipping away, and he had no idea how to stop it. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Then he folded his arms across his massive chest and fixed Carter with a steady, unblinking stare. "Nah," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "The whole world is about to see exactly what you did." Carter's breath caught in his throat. A sharp notification ping echoed from someone's phone. The video was already spreading, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The internet doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. Within minutes of the video hitting social media, it spread like wildfire. What started as a few scattered uploads from the grocery store turned into a full-blown digital storm. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, every platform was flooded with the same footage. Sergeant Carter in full uniform, punching a teenage grocery clerk over a checkout line. The outrage was immediate. People weren't just angry. They were furious. Hashtags exploded across social media. "Fire Sergeant Carter" trended within the hour. Our "Justice for Jamal" followed closely behind, demanding accountability. And then there was number Shaq the GOAT, because the world had already chosen a side. People from all over the country rushed to comment, retweet, and share their disgust. Celebrities chimed in, activists called for justice, and thousands of users flooded the police department's official accounts with demands for Carter's termination. The entire city was watching, waiting for action. By the time news channels picked up the story, it was already too late for Carter. His name, once just another officer among many, was now the most hated in the city. His photo, screenshotted from the video, was plastered on TV screens, news articles, and online petitions. At first, Carter tried to stay quiet, thinking it would blow over. He underestimated just how much the world had changed. The video was everywhere. There was no escaping it. Outside his precinct, reporters had already gathered. "Sergeant Carter, do you have any response to the allegations?" one journalist called out as he stepped outside the station. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in his direction. He kept walking, his jaw clenched, sweat forming at his temples. But the whispers, the insults, the glares, they were impossible to ignore. Back inside, the police chief's office was in chaos. Phones rang nonstop, emails poured in, and the department's reputation was crumbling by the second. Then came the final blow, a press conference. The mayor, looking exhausted and furious, stepped up to the podium, cameras broadcasting live. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for doubt. "Carter needs to be dealt with, immediately." Carter's fate was no longer in his hands. The system he once hid behind was now turning against him. The cameras flashed as the police chief stepped up to the podium, gripping the edges as if bracing himself for the firestorm ahead. His expression was grim, his forehead slick with sweat under the harsh lights of the press conference. The entire city was watching, waiting to see if the department would actually hold one of its own accountable. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice measured, careful. "Effective immediately, Sergeant Carter has been placed on suspension pending a full investigation." The room erupted. Reporters fired questions one after another. Why wasn't he fired? What about Jamal? Is this just a PR move? The police chief raised his hands in a weak attempt to regain control. "We will ensure that justice is served," he insisted, but his words felt hollow. Across town, Shaq sat in a private lounge, watching the press conference on a massive screen. His arms were crossed, his jaw tight. Suspension. That was all they were doing? After punching a teenager on camera and abusing his power, Carter was getting nothing more than a temporary slap on the wrist? Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. A few feet away, Jamal sat next to his mother, his bruised face still swollen from the punch. His mother clutched his hand, shaking her head at the screen. "He's gonna walk away from this, isn't he?" she said softly, anger thick in her voice. Shaq's eyes darkened. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Without another word, Shaq pulled out his phone and dialed. The call connected within seconds. "Get my lawyer on the line," Shaq said, his voice firm. "We're taking this all the way." Across the room, Jamal's eyes widened. His mother turned to Shaq, confused. "What are you planning?" Shaq didn't answer right. Away, he watched the screen for another second, his mind already 5 steps ahead. Then finally he turned to them with a small smirk. Let's just say, by tomorrow morning, the whole city's going to be talking. Whatever Shaq was planning, it wasn't just about Carter anymore. It was about the entire system, and things were about to get a lot bigger. The morning after the press conference, the city woke up to a headline that no one saw coming. Shaq files lawsuit against police department, demands justice for Jamal. News anchors dissected every detail, social media exploded with reactions, and Carter, who had already been drowning in backlash, felt the ground beneath him start to crumble. At a massive press event, cameras flashed as Shaq stepped up to the podium, standing beside Jamal and his mother. His presence alone commanded the room, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who wasn't here to play games. Suspension? Shaq said, shaking his head. That's not justice. That's a vacation. He turned to the cameras, his gaze intense. We all saw what happened. This wasn't some misunderstanding. Sergeant Carter abused his power. He put his hands on a kid, someone just trying to do his job. And now they think they can just wait for the outrage to die down? Not happening. A murmur ran through the crowd. Reporters scrambled to write down every word, sensing this was bigger than just one bad cop. This was about the entire system. That's why, Shaq continued, gripping the podium, I'm filing a lawsuit against the police department for protecting violent officers like Carter. And I'm making sure Jamal gets the best legal team money can buy, because we're making an example out of him. The crowd erupted. Carter, watching from his home, felt the blood drain from his face. His hands clenched into fists as he paced his living room. This was spiraling out of control. Suspension was one thing, but if this lawsuit went through, his career wouldn't just be over. His whole life would be ruined. He grabbed his phone, fingers shaking, and dialed his lawyer. We need to fight this. Now, his attorney's voice was calm, but firm. Carter, listen to me. This is a PR nightmare. You need to lay low. Carter's pulse pounded. Are you kidding me? Shaq's turning me into a national disgrace. You expect me to just sit here? The lawyer sighed. You don't have many options left. Carter's jaw tightened. If the system wouldn't protect him, he'd have to protect himself. But how far was he willing to go? Sergeant Carter sat in the brightly lit television studio, his palms sweating despite the freezing air conditioning. This was his last chance, his final play to save himself before the lawsuit, the media, and the entire city destroyed him. Across from him, a stone-faced news anchor adjusted her earpiece, waiting for the countdown. The cameras were set, the stage was ready, and in just seconds, he would be broadcasting live to millions of viewers, all of whom already despised him. Going live in 3, 2. The red light flashed on. Carter straightened his tie, forcing an expression of calm indignation. He needed to make people see him as the victim, not the villain. Thank you for joining us, Sergeant Carter, the anchor began, her tone polite but sharp. You've been suspended following a viral video showing you punching a teenage grocery clerk. Many are calling for your termination, while others, most notably Shaquille O'Neal, are pushing for a lawsuit against the department. What do you have to say to the public? Carter exhaled through his nose, leaning forward slightly to appear confident. This entire situation has been blown out of proportion, he began, his voice steady but laced with bitterness. What people don't understand is that being in law enforcement means making tough calls. The public sees a single clip, but they don't see what led up to it. This is nothing more than an attack on officers like me, who put our lives on the line every day. The anchor didn't blink. An attack? You're saying you're the victim here? Carter nodded firmly. Absolutely. I was just trying to maintain order, and now I'm being dragged through the mud. The anchor tilted her head slightly. Let's be clear about something, Sergeant. She turned to face the screen, where the infamous video clip was now playing on loop. The grocery store, the punch, the moment Shaq stepped in. She turned back to Carter. Did you punch that teenager? Carter's face twitched. His voice caught in his throat. The anchor waited, her silence pressing down on him like a weight. The camera zoomed in on his face, catching every nervous flicker in his expression. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Finally, Carter opened his mouth again. But before he could even form an excuse, something he never expected happened. The network cut his mic. The screen flashed back to the news anchor, who didn't even try to hide her smirk. And there you have it, folks. She folded her hands. I think the video speaks for itself. Carter sat there humiliated as the entire city watched his last chance slip through his fingers. The city had already turned against Sergeant Carter, but Shaq was about to finish the job. The next morning, reporters gathered outside a grand conference hall, cameras flashing, microphones positioned, and anticipation running high. This wasn't just another media event. This was a reckoning. Inside, Shaq sat at a long table with Jamal and his mother beside him. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone carried weight. He leaned forward, adjusted the microphone, and spoke into the sea of reporters. I told y'all this wasn't over. His deep voice rumbled through the speakers. People like Carter don't just wake up one day and decide to abuse their power. This ain't the first time. This is just the first time he got caught. A murmur ran through the crowd as Shaq lifted a thick folder and slapped it onto the table. The cameras zoomed in. These are complaints against Sergeant Carter, ones that were ignored. Shaq's voice grew sharper. Turns out, he's been getting away with this for years. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled to take notes as Shaq pulled out printed documents and held them up for everyone to see. 2019, assaulted a homeless man during a traffic stop. No charges filed. 2020, used excessive force on a teenager. The case was lost in paperwork. Shaq's eyes darkened as he slammed the final sheet onto the table. And last year, he broke a woman's wrist because she didn't comply fast enough. Guess what happened to that case? Nothing. The room erupted. Reporters shouted over each other. Camera flashes flickered like lightning, and across the city, people watching from their screens felt their anger boil over. It didn't take long for the police chief to respond. Within an hour, a shaky, hastily put-together press conference was held at the department headquarters. The chief's face was tense, drained of color. After reviewing the evidence presented, he said stiffly, Sergeant Carter is hereby terminated from the force, effective immediately. The words sealed Carter's fate. But it wasn't just his job he was losing. By the end of the day, Carter would be in handcuffs, paying for the crimes he thought he got away with. The sun hung low over the city as news cameras rolled, capturing the moment no one ever thought they'd see. Sergeant Carter, once a man who strutted through his precinct with arrogance, who wore his badge like a shield against consequences, was now being led out of his own department in handcuffs. The scene was almost poetic. The same officers who once stood beside him were now escorting him out, their grips firm, their faces unreadable. Carter's uniform was gone. Instead, he wore a wrinkled dress shirt, his sleeves rolled up as if he had thrown them on in a hurry. Sweat glistened on his forehead. His once confident stride was now a reluctant shuffle. The crowd outside erupted the moment he stepped into view. Shouts of, "Justice for Jamal!" rang out, signs waved in the air, and reporters surged forward, microphones extended. The flashing cameras reflected in Carter's panicked eyes. A journalist pushed through. Sergeant Carter, do you have anything to say about your arrest? Carter's mouth opened, but no words came out. How had it come to this? Just days ago, he had been untouchable, a police officer, respected or feared wherever he went. He had thought he could do whatever he wanted, push people around, throw a punch here and there, and walk away clean. But now Shaq had turned the entire city against him. A cameraman zoomed in, broadcasting his humiliation to the world. The lead officer read out his charges. Sergeant Carter, you are under arrest for assault, misconduct, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spoken those same words to others countless times. But now he was the one hearing them. His fists clenched. His career was over. His name was ruined. The police force had cut ties with him. His lawyer had stopped returning his calls. And the city he once controlled had turned on him like a pack of wolves. His breathing grew uneven as reporters threw more questions at him. Carter, do you regret punching Jamal? What do you have to say about Shaq's lawsuit? Will you fight the charges? Finally, his boiling frustration snapped. His head jerked up, eyes burning with rage and desperation. And through clenched teeth, his voice trembling with fury, he spat out his final words before being shoved into the police car. Shaq did this to me. As the door slammed shut, the world watched, and no one felt sorry for him. The world had seen Sergeant Carter fall, but now it was time for Jamal to rise. As the chaos of the trial and Carter's downfall unfolded, Jamal's life took a turn he never expected. The bruises on his face had faded, seemed to break. His shoulders sagged, his hands shook slightly, And before he could stop himself, tears burned at the corners of his eyes. Shaq said nothing. He let the silence stretch as Daniels chewed, swallowed, and finally, looked up at him with eyes filled with something Shaq hadn't seen before. Guilt, regret, a kind of pain that only came when a man realized he was never as strong as he thought he was. Daniels exhaled shakily, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd be here." Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. His tone was calm, steady, but firm. "That's the problem," he said. "You never thought about them either." Daniels closed his eyes for a second, his face twisting as if the words physically hurt. When he opened them again, his voice was so quiet Shaq almost didn't hear it. "I was wrong." Months had passed since that fateful night at the gas station. The story of Officer Daniels' downfall had faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new viral moments. But for the people who had been directly affected, for Harold, for the homeless community, for Daniels himself, the impact was far from over. Shaq had never been the type to stop at just exposing a problem. He wanted to fix it. That's why, standing in front of a small but eager crowd at a local community center, he held a microphone in one hand and a vision in the other. "We can't just call out injustice," Shaq said, his deep voice carrying through the room. "We have to do something about it." Behind him, a banner stretched across the stage. Project Second Chance, a path from homelessness to stability. It wasn't just words, it was action. Shaq had poured his own money, resources, and connections into creating a program that helped the homeless get back on their feet. Housing assistance, job training, mental health support, real solutions for real people. In the front row, Harold sat, clean-shaven and wearing new clothes that actually fit him. His eyes, once filled with exhaustion, now carried a quiet sense of peace. He wasn't sleeping on the streets anymore. Shaq had made sure of that. "I don't know how to thank you, man," Harold had told Shaq when he handed him the keys to his new apartment. "Nobody ever cared before." Shaq had just smiled. "They do now." But the biggest surprise of all was Daniels. The former cop stood off to the side, dressed in a simple button-down and jeans. No badge, no authority, just a man trying to start over. He had joined the program not as a leader, not as someone special, but as another person trying to rebuild his life. It hadn't been easy. At first, no one wanted him there. The very people he had once tormented looked at him with suspicion. But over time, he showed up. Every day without fail. He scrubbed floors, stacked chairs, handed out food. He never asked for special treatment, never complained. And now, as Shaq shook Harold's hand in front of the crowd, he glanced toward Daniels, meeting his gaze with a knowing look. "You finally learned," Shaq said, his voice low enough that only Daniels could hear. Then after a beat, he added, "But it cost you everything." But the memory of that punch, the sheer humiliation of being assaulted for doing his job, still lingered. But Shaq wasn't done yet. At a packed press event, Jamal sat beside his mother, their fingers tightly intertwined. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned in, and the world watched as Shaq stepped up to the podium once again. The room quieted as he spoke. Jamal didn't just survive this. He showed strength, patience, and class. Even when he had every reason to be angry, Shaq turned toward him, eyes full of pride. "That kind of character? It deserves to be rewarded." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. Then in front of millions watching live, Shaq pulled out a document and slid it across the table. "Jamal, this is a full college scholarship. Tuition, housing, everything. Paid in full." Gasps rippled through the room. Jamal's mother clapped her hands over her mouth, eyes filling with tears. Her son, who had once worried about affording school, now had his future secured. Jamal himself was frozen, hands shaking as he reached for the paper. I don't know what to say," Shaq grinned. "You don't gotta say anything. Just make us proud." But that wasn't all. The manager of the grocery store stepped forward next. The same store where Jamal had worked tirelessly, showing up day after day, only to be disrespected by people like Carter. "Jamal, we've watched you grow into a hard-working, respected employee," the manager announced. "And we'd like to offer you a full-time management position, if you'll have it." The crowd erupted in applause. Tears streamed down Jamal's mother's face as she sobbed into a microphone. "Shaq saved my son's future." Jamal wiped his eyes, overwhelmed, his life changing before him in real time. But Shaq wasn't done yet. He had one final move left, and it was bigger than anyone expected. Some stories fade with time, but this one changed the city forever. Days after Sergeant Carter's arrest, Shaq took the stage once again. But this time, it wasn't just about Jamal. It was about making sure what happened to him never happened again. Standing before a massive crowd in front of City Hall, Shaq leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and full of conviction. We all saw what happened. We all saw how power was abused. He glanced at Jamal, who stood beside him, no longer just a victim, but a symbol of resilience. I'm done watching innocent people suffer while bad cops walk away free. That ends today. The crowd roared in approval. Shaq paused, letting the energy settle before delivering his next words. I'm launching the Justice for Workers Foundation. This program will provide legal protection for workers like Jamal, so they never have to fight alone. Applause erupted, echoing down the streets. But that's not all. Shaq turned to the mayor, who stood off to the side, nodding along. We worked with city officials to introduce new laws, ones that hold officers accountable for abusing their power. No more suspensions, no more covering things up. If a cop crosses the line, Shaq folded his arms. They're done. The cheers were deafening. Jamal's mother wiped away fresh tears, watching her son stand beside the man who had changed his life. The moment felt bigger than all of them. And just when the crowd thought it was over, Shaq smiled and said, "One more thing." The next day, he walked into the same grocery store where it all started. The shelves were stocked, the lines were long, and the air smelled of fresh produce and warm bread. But something had changed. As Shaq stepped up to the checkout lane, Jamal, now wearing a manager's name tag, smiled and shook his hand. "Didn't think I'd see you back here, man," Jamal said, grinning. Shaq chuckled. "Had to see it for myself. Looking good, boss." Jamal laughed, shaking his head. "All because of you." Shaq's smile faded slightly, turning serious. "Nah, one punch ruined his life. One act of justice changed yours." The camera flashes captured the moment. The image of two men, one whose life was destroyed by his own actions, and one whose life had just begun. And the city? It would never forget.